Kathy is here and is in another time zone completely. She started her St. Patrick's Day celebrations. So I'm going to hand over to Eric now. Everybody is muted. We'll take questions at the end and hand over to Eric to introduce Kathy. So again, apologies about that. So you're on, Eric.
Okay, everybody, those of you that are out there, it's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker for tonight. Through the wonders of Zoom, when it works, and when it doesn't, it can be a real monster. Kathy is talking to us tonight from Sydney. She's speaking on Who's Been Living in My House, Clarecastle, 1855 to 1970, based on her transcriptions of the Griffith Valuation books. Kathy is a native of Clarecastle, same as myself. She's been living in Sydney since 1986. Now in 2019, she decided to do an MA History of Family degree with the University of Limerick, and her dissertation was Clarecastle 1901 to 1911. And as part of that, to get information, Kathy transcribed the Council book for 1896 to 1910. She did very well with her degree, and in 2020, during the first lockdown in Sydney, Kathy decided for her sins to transcribe all the Council books from 1855 to 1970 for the village or town of Clarecastle. And when she had that done, she very kindly offered to donate all her research papers to our heritage group here in Clarecastle. I'm a member of Clarecastle Heritage as well as Clare Roots. So she donated that to us. We have a website under the Irish Country Archives Network, and under the auspices of the National Museum. Now, they had never come across a project like this, so they had to develop software that would take the spreadsheets on board and that. But we had a great satisfactory setup with them, and in September 2020, the system went live. So we're delighted, and we're very grateful to Kathy for that donation. She's a glutton for punishment. She's since gone on and transcribed 3 further townlands around the village of Clarecastle. Now, I can hand over to Kathy now, and hopefully the links will stay up and we'll enjoy her talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for the invitation to speak and to Clare Roots. We looked at we're looking at the revision books, the cancelled or revision books. And what are these? These are the Griffith Valuation was done in Clare in the mid-1850s as part of the whole of Ireland, Griffith or Primary Valuation of Ireland. And then the cancelled or revision books were a series of ledgers prepared by the Valuation Office to keep the information up to date. So they were revised, was where we get the revision from, and the old information was cancelled. Next slide, please, Jane. This is the 1904 beautiful Ordnance survey of the 1842 Ordnance survey of Clarecastle with great detail. The line down the middle, or to the slightly right of the middle, is in the maps when we see them, and shows the detail, particularly around the castle and the River Fergus flowing down towards the quay. Clarecastle is built over 2 townlands, the townland of Clare Commons, which is to the, the Ennis side, which is going upwards, and then Clare Hill on the south, on the southern, or well, really southeastern part. And the line in brown are the roads, and the roads are pretty much the same as they still are now. And until 2007, that was the main road through the west of Ireland from Limerick to Galway and on to Ennis. I'll just mention it towards the top of the screen, within the green in Clare Commons. They were the layout of the houses in the Commons, and I've got a further map down the way that will show a rearrangement of the houses on both sides of the road in Clare Commons, above the church that occurred after the famine because of the drop in population. So next slide, please. Right, just to orientate those of you that are not Clarecastle people. Clarecastle is just south of Ennis in County Clare, obviously. And the photo on the right is one from the Lawrence collection, taken if you were coming in a horse and carriage from the Limerick side, coming up the village. And again, quite a lot of these houses and buildings are as they were shown on the photo. There's been a few changes, but it's amazing what has remained, particularly on the right-hand side of the street. Next slide, please, Jane. This is a very quick sort of summary of the work leading up to the completion of the primary valuation. And then the last timeline is the revision council book timeline. So there had been a move by the English government in London to create a more equitable local tax, and there was the Springweiss report in around about 1824. Richard Griffith, who was already an eminent engineer in Ireland, a Dublin-born man who lived a very long life, he was appointed to start a boundary survey, because one of the issues they had was they didn't have very good maps of Ireland. So the first sort of job, if you like, which really didn't start till 1830, was to map the country, and that included going round and doing surveys, going around collecting names of townlands. And as a lot of us know, some townland names disappeared. It certainly happened in, not so much in my Clarecastle family, but in my mother's family. There was a series of changes in the 1840s. A few counties had been valued, but they decided to basically start the work again. And that started in 1846 to 65. And with Clare being published in 1856, and the Town of Clare's, which is on the next sheet, is one of the, was published as part of the full survey of Clare. And then from 1856 to 1970, we have a series of there are different names for them, but I call them the revision council books. There are 9 separate ledgers. They were very diligent in the early years, updating them quite frequently. They would start with a new ledger, all handwritten, and then if something changed, they would strike it out with just one pencil mark, often using a different color pen or pencil. And that the colors in themselves allow you to help with dating as well. Probably by the 1870s, they started to put dates in when the changes occurred. The frequency of the revision books lengthened to, we've mentioned 1896 to 1910, well, that's 14 years. And then the next one was 1910 to 24, and then another 10 years. And then we have the 1934 to 70, which was the longest and the last one. So next slide, please, Jane. This is just a very quick, just an example of for those of you that haven't used Griffith, the publication. This is just a page from the first page of 5 from the Clarecastle or the Town of Clare. The immediate left-hand column is the numbering, and we start with Clare Commons and then it moves on to Clare Hill. And the first 4 were just fields, individual fields, and then the village in the Clare Commons part were all notated as 5.1, 5.2, etc. And that numbering has stayed the same right through to 1970. So that first column makes centering and finding information, it's kind of your center if you use the 1855-56 document as your starting point. There are some changes, and I think it's the around about 1892, there's a remark in one of the columns about they need to straighten up some properties because they, I think there was some disputes about ownership and tenancies in that period. So that there appeared to be like a mini survey completed, and that's alluded to in the I think it's the 1884 to 1995 survey council book. The next slide, please, Jane. This is and I mentioned earlier the map, the first map, and again, I'll draw your attention to the top left-hand corner. There in the coloured map, in that previous map, you would have seen, I'll call it a higgledy-piggledy arrangement of houses. In this one, the Lord Inchi Quinn took advantage of the drop in population to straighten up and improve. Well, I don't know if the houses were improved, but we don't have that information. But the gardens, and whether they were fenced, but at least they were surveyed and straightened up, if you like. So that was done mainly on the, if I can use the phrase, the Madden's Terrace side. So if you're going towards Ennis from Clarecastle, on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, there were properties, but the census from that time, which counted Clare Commons separate from Clare Hill, showed a very drastic reduction in population in Clare Commons. And in fact, by I think it's the 1870 census, either the 60 or the 70 census, the two were being merged together. Next slide, please, Jane. This is the period that I've mentioned. These are the periods which the council books were available. So there was one completed in 1858, 2 years after the publication. But the reality is that some of the information, even in the 1855, 56, Griffiths was probably already out of date. As we know, when we publish something, things have moved on. So there are a number of changes in 1858. And then, as you can see, the frequency then sort of broadened. There's lots of information, particularly in the Commons column on the right, and I'll bring up an example now in a minute. Next slide, please, Jane. This is the Clare Commons map. Clare Commons is a small townland of approximately 45 acres, and it had 5 lots or tenements, 5 separate entries, if you like, in terms of the numbering. There were lots more entries than that, but in terms of denoting lots 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. And 5, as you can see, is quite big and covers basically the village and going all the way up on either side of the road in what's now St. Michael's and Madden's Terrace, up as far as Bridges House, but not the school. The school comes in under Balacafada. And the village goes all the way down slightly off the map here, and includes what we now know today as the church drive, and it's just I suppose it was known back then as Fair Green Lane, and it had some street names, and the Griffith Valuation further divides things into Clare Commons, Town of Clare, Main Street, and that's numbers 5.1 to 5.38. And the Main Street included the present day Patrick Street. So the Main Street ran straight up towards Clare Hill. We then had a street called, or a road called Kildysart Road, which is now Lissan Road. Just quickly, this is Clare Hill, which is a lot bigger and included farmland. So this was a good exercise in doing an urban area plus a rural area all in one. So they have different challenges transcribing the two. Clare Hill is, as I said, 152 acres, includes the cemetery, the graveyard, and includes the quay and the port of Clare and a lot of industrial areas. And there were a lot of changes, particularly in that part of Clare Hill over the next 130 odd years. Next slide, please, Jane, sorry. Right, this is an extract from the 1859 to 63 And it just shows, I chose it for a number of reasons, but one was to show the change in the situation in Clarecastle. This is post the famine. The militia had been barracked, the militia, including the Ordnance Survey, had been barracked in what we knew, or what I grew up knowing as Suttons. And this is showing the change, if you like, after the militia was withdrawn and moved to Ennis, and the Ordnance Survey, well, some of the Ordnance Survey continued living in Clarecastle and were still there in the early 1900s. But there was a change in the use of this rather large, industrial, I don't know what you'd call it, a warehouse type building, which had many changes in use. And it was Bannatynes that Ennis historians and Limerick historians would be familiar with. Bannatynes had it, and then it changed to Richard Scott, and later on, John. It changed. Its use changed a number of times to more modern times. When I remember it as Sutton's Cold Store, when that closed. I think Whelan's are in there now. But this just gives you an idea of the change, how the changes were made in different coloured inks, and the uses. I haven't put up all of this. The whole ledger is probably would print out best in an A3 sheet, so they're quite big sheets. Next slide, please. I'll run into a couple of case studies just to show you the usefulness of the cancelled books to whether you're a family historian, local historian, just have an interest in the history of the development of an area. This is I'll call it the 1896 RIC barracks as it was first built. So this is now faces what we call Barrack Street. It's part now of the castle complex, particularly the downstairs front left window is part of the lovely coffee house there. The notation, which I appreciate, can't be read very easily, but this is a full one-pager at the beginning of the 1896 cancelled book. And it talked about the new commodious barracks that had been built to accommodate 2 families. And in the 1901 census, we can see the sergeant and his family, the Coles, living upstairs, and downstairs, I can't remember their surname, but a family, quite a young constable with a wife and baby. That constable went on to big and better things in the RIC. He eventually ended up in, I think, Tyrone. And Sergeant Cole was a bit more famous locally, and poor man, yes, he got a lot of unfavourable media from all sides. But this is an example of some of the information you might find in the cancelled books. And they vary from just a couple of lines in the comments column to a full page like we have here. The previous RIC barracks had been down roughly where those of you know Clarecastle, O'Mara's shop. So going back towards Limerick, on the left-hand side, just before the bridge, the barracks was in the back there. All that is left now is, I think, a wall. So this, as I said, is an example. So if you have RIC in the family, this might be of interest to some. It might be interest to, and I brought it up partly because of last month's lecture, and also because my great-grandfather, Patrick McSherry, was RIC, and by then he had left. He wasn't he was stationed in Clarecastle in the 1870s, but by then he had married my Clarecastle-born great-grandmother, Ellen McGrath, and they were next door in the new corner house, and they were the people that were responsible for building what we know today as the castle, but I call it the corner house. And the two are now joined, but they were built as separate buildings, well, built separately back in the day. Next slide, please, Jane. Then this is an example from, I've called it Who's Been Living in One House. These are 6 of 7 houses built in the 1880s by Patrick O'Brien to provide better accommodation for people either coming to work in his mills or in his other industries, or just to attract people to the village. Patrick O'Brien was, we believe, a local man. There was Patrick O'Brien Senior and Junior. By then, I think his father had died. And the O'Briens were, owned a lot of the houses, or the land that a lot of the houses were built on in the village. So we've got 7 houses from Frawley's pub. So right down, if you look right into the middle right of the picture, you see a lower roof. So the houses I'm talking about come up towards us from that. So that pub wasn't part of the O'Brien estate. That's Frawley's pub. I can't remember what it's called now, but that Frawley's pub in itself has been there all this time, run by one family. I know it's been run by another family now, but I'm talking about when I lived in Clarecastle. So those houses, plus the 3 that are in the distance that were the priests and Henley's house further down towards the bridge, and another group of houses in Key Road, were all built round about the same time by Patrick O'Brien. Anyway, I've pulled out the one house, the lot number. So it's lot number 5.8. And it's the first of those houses, the house next door to the pub. And it shows the changes in one house. So whilst we've transcribed and put up each of the individual council books as separate spreadsheets, it's possible to come back, copy them and put them into one smaller spreadsheet if you're interested in one family or interested in the history of one property. So we can see the notation a bit further down about the middle, where we see the land was originally owned by it was part of the Stamer estate, and Duchess of de Rovigo was a local Clarecastle born Duchess, who she married a Frenchman who got his title through Napoleon. She was later succeeded by her daughter and son-in-law, and finally Patrick O'Brien acquired the estates. Her daughter was Maria Burton, and you can see the difference in the. I've put the valuation here at £4. That gives you an indication that the house had been improved. The previous house valuation was quite a lot less. And as I said, there were 7 houses built on the village, and they're all still there, and have recently been part of the beautification of the main street. And it comes right up to 1970. So you can see the house was actually, that particular house was used as a curate's or a priest's house. I think it was curate's, and then the use changed, and then it was acquired by, I believe, a family that still live there today. So this gives you an example of if you find somebody in the 1850s and you want to see what's happened to that property, be it land or a house, you can follow it all the way through. Next slide, please, Jane. This is, I call this locating a family which left. A couple of weeks ago, Eric put up Alice Gearon's photograph from the vintage lens. And Alice is a relation. So we've got a mini family tree here. And forgive me doing something personal, but I thought it was a good opportunity. Alice is my second cousin once removed, and despite the difference in timelines, you would expect a third cousin or something else, but you can see there where the link was. The original Roughans that we can step back to is John Roughan and Anne King, and their eldest son, John Roughan, he was known in some things that I've read as John Roughan Jr. I don't have a birth date for him, but thanks to both the work that the Clare Roots have done in transcribing graveyards, including Killone, where the family was buried, we're able to, and newspaper accounts, we're able to track him. Now, he died very young. He was only in his early 30s. My great-grandfather was one of the younger children in that family, and I'm descendant on the right-hand side. That'll show you the connection down. John and his wife, Margaret McGrath, had 5 children, their eldest daughter, Winifred, and in the 1873, I think it is, she appears in the wills. And you can see that John Roughan died in 1861 from the information, but the will was only proven because his wife also died in 1869. So there were 5 children orphaned. They were all minors at their mother's death. The youngest was only, the youngest of them, Catherine, was born the year that the father, she was born 3 or 4 months after the father's death. I've known about the Gearan connection, sort of, kind of, but it's through a process of research that we didn't know exactly what the relationship was until various things like the transcription of the deaths and the, you know, finding bits and pieces that we were actually able to piece it together. And to my surprise, I found that not alone did Winifred Roughan, who is Alice's mother, married Patrick Gearan, who was also a Clarecastle man. They and their 2 daughters, Alice and her sister Anne, were born in and baptized in Clarecastle. And the family then migrated to Queensland. And Alice then became famous as a poet. She died young in 1841. Her husband lived quite a bit longer. He was a German migrant. They had 5 children. So there are descendants of her and one of her brothers. Another one of her brothers died in the First World War. And in fact, one of her sons fought in the Second World War, but survived. Winifred, who was my grandfather's first cousin, was his godmother when my grandfather was born. So, you know, she was a good 20 plus years older than, even though they were first cousins. And also, we think, but we're not sure, and this is one of the hypotheses that the council books have thrown up, is that Margaret McGrath may have been related to my grandmother's side of the family as well, but that's a hypothesis for another day. But it just shows the value of the Griffith Valuation and the council books in seeing, sort of following a family through and seeing when they go. So the family did come to Australia, but I've only managed to follow Winifred. I followed 2 of her siblings. Both of them died without children. So I don't know what happened to the other 2, Joseph and Catherine, yet. So that's an ongoing research. Next slide, please, Jane. This is, I appreciate it's not easy to read, but these are the 4 lots that the Gearan Roughan family were associated with in Clare Hill. And one of them, as I said, tantalizingly, has a property passing from a Terence McGrath to Margaret Roughan, who was born McGrath. So that's where I get the hypothesis. But as I said, that's research for another day. Next slide, please, Jane. So helping a family historian, what I'm trying to do with these slides is show some of the different uses and who might use them for, for family history. So David Costello lives in England, and he's a member of a family with a very long association, particularly with the port. And his, I think it was great-grandfather, was a river pilot, as was his great-great-grandfather. And through the research, we actually discovered an extra generation. We were able to link another, a connection back to his 3 times great-grandfather. This photograph from the early 1960s is a shop that the Costello family, so it would have been a great-granduncle and family of David's, they had a shop in Clarecastle. Now, that shop and everything to the left of it on that side was demolished probably, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was about 1968 to 70 to make way. There was Sullivan's shop right on the corner, and it's now the car park, and behind it is the playground in Clarecastle. But the Costello's shop was there certainly during the census time and right up to, I don't remember the shop open as a child, but I remember the shop front. And next door is Powers, which still exists. So this is taken from the back of, or from Key Road to the side and back of Powers pub. So next slide, please, Jane. And these were just a few comments that David sent me. I asked him for permission to use his family story. I should mention that the Costellos came up in my research. They're what I call one of my random families in doing the census, when I was doing the analysis of the census for my dissertation. So we started an email correspondence around that time. He has an awful lot more information, but as I said, the revision books helped bring back one more generation. It dispels some hypotheses, and like a lot of this research does, it creates some more, you know, it sends you down another rabbit hole, as I call it. The small shop that I mentioned was demolished in the 1960s. David says that there was a court case in the 1870s that was the subject of a letter between a couple of sisters. So his great-grandfather's sisters, one of whom had gone to America and one who was still living in Clarecastle. And not sure of which house this applies to, but there was a session record about evictions because the Costellos lived also in the Key Road, and David's immediate great-grandfather, if I can use the phrase, came and went from Clarecastle and eventually did settle back. The fact that he was an engineer and he lived some of the time, or his work took him some of the time to Kilkee. So you see the Costello name in the Key Road moving in and out a couple of times in the council books. Next slide, please, and I'll bring you on to another case study. These are a couple of photographs of the Commons, and this is taken, I think the left-hand side one, and Eric will correct me, I believe it might be what we call the Sergeant Long photograph. Sergeant Long had been a policeman or a guard in Clarecastle, and this is taken, he lived just above in a house just beside St. Michael's Terrace. So this shows on the photo on the left shows St. Michael's Terrace, just the last of the houses, number 12, and also then looks directly onto what was the houses on that's the other side of the road in Clare Commons that were then demolished to make way for Madden's Terrace. And the bottom right-hand photo, the smaller photo, are the first 4 photos of St. Michael's Terrace. And I'll explain why they're in there in a second. Next slide, please. The new streetscape. So by probably about 1954 or so, this is what the road from Clarecastle, from the church going towards Ennis, looked like. Madden's Terrace on the right and St. Michael's on the left. And you can barely make out in a very small, in the sort of trees, that would have been Sergeant Long's house. And he was a great photographer. And we've even got some family photos of us as babies, myself and my oldest brother next to me, photos of us as children taken in his garden. So St. Michael's Terrace was built first, and then Madden's Terrace was built. But what's interesting when you look at the the council books for the period, is the occupiers and the changes to the lots and the cancellations of who owned what and when is very well documented on the Madden's Terrace side, but not on the St. Michael's side. So I can go in the transcribing the 1934 to 70 council book was probably harder than doing the other 8 on their own because of so many changes over such a long period of time. But it actually accurately captures who the new occupiers of the 25 houses were in Madden's Terrace. So that's quite a nice record for that family, and also shows the changes in the lot numbers. There were quite a substantial amount of crossing out and figuring it out. But we don't have the same in the Michael's Terrace side. We see that the county council acquired the land, but we don't see who the new occupiers are, which is a pity in the sense of the continuity that the Madden's Terrace gives us to 1970. So next slide, please, Jane. I think I've said most of that. Oh yeah, the benefits, I've coming towards the end now, and sorry if I'm speaking fast. The benefits and challenges in completing the transcription. The biggest benefit is that their primary source document recording periods of time in the village history from, as I said, 1856, records the changes in tenancy, ownership, and indicates when new buildings were constructed or all fell into ruin at various times. It's amazing the number of houses that had in ruins. In other words, there was no poor law rates to be paid from them. Sometimes they changed from a house into a garden, and then maybe a number of years later they might be merged with next door, or so you see a lot of changes to the value within the valuation to what happens to even a small block of land. Shows continuity, as I said, from the original Griffith, and can be used with other records to reconstruct the history. So, for example, with up to about the 1890s, pubs were recorded as separate. It was recorded as a house, not a public house or a shop. So we start to see differentiation in some buildings as to what type of business might be carried on there. But if you use some of the old, say, the Slaters or the Guys directories, which the Ennis ones often include Clarecastle, you're able to see, for example, there were milliners and saddlers, and it was quite a self-contained village. You had the Smiths that ran. You could go and book your ticket to go on the train, and I presume also book your ticket to emigrate. You could equally do it in Ennis, but there was quite a lot that you could do within Clarecastle. So if you marry the Griffith valuation with the names and the people running businesses, you can get a further picture. So I always see this as a kind of like slices of the pizza, and it may not be a whole pizza, but it's the slices that help you with other newspaper articles, photographs, other pieces of information, just to give you a sort of an idea of what was happening at periods of time. The 1880s appeared to be a period of relative prosperity with the further expansion of the port. There was an expansion in the 1840s. O'Brien, there was investment by a number of entrepreneurs like Patrick O'Brien, the Kellys, and others in providing industry into the port. And then when they started to collapse, particularly after the sawmills fire in the sawmills near the quay, you start to see a decline and people moving away. And you see that I documented that in my dissertation for a number of families because their work wasn't there anymore. So it's quite a useful, I suppose I hate using the phrase census substitute because it gives you family names, but it doesn't give you how many were living in the house. So it's good and bad. Some of the challenges were deciphering the notations and writing, especially, as I mentioned before, the 1934 to 70 book. There's possible transcription errors. I did send it out for a proof, but it was largely my own work. And the way we did it, I kind of did the first round and then I went back and completed, separated the spreadsheets to the way they are now. And that was a good opportunity to make sure that I hadn't, and even now I'm still finding things that I perhaps would not transcribe differently, but I haven't struck out some people's names. And as I said, some information was not reported to or recorded by the valuation office, such as I mentioned the St. Michael's Terrace, but also Patrick O'Brien, who died in 1900, continued to be recorded as the immediate lessor right through to the 1960s, and when the last of his daughters died. So there are, you deal with it with a degree of, research from other sources, of course. So that's it in a nutshell. So next slide, please, Jane. And Eric and Hassan from ICANN have put it up on the Clarecastle Ballier Clare Heritage. That's the the large URL, the long URL for it, but if you Google Clarecastle Council Books, you'll find it as well. And it's been married with, Eric and Hassan have married with maps of each of the townlands, so that you can go immediately to those maps that I showed you earlier, so that you can at least locate roughly where the family was if you're a family researcher. And also I've done a one-pager to go with each council book, just highlighting, you know, if I found some interesting information in the newspapers or during my research. Because as Eric alluded at the beginning, I did this, I was due to return to Ireland on the 1st of May 2020. And of course, Australia went into its famous lockdown, and we've only opened our borders in the last few months. So I knew I wasn't coming home. So it was a good way of visiting without leaving the country. So it was a good exercise, and it was winter time and all the rest of it. So I don't know if I would have done it as quickly or done it at all, or I probably would have needed more support in doing it, because I've since, as Eric mentioned, I've done a number of townlands. I'm just finishing Ballybeg, and with the townlands, I'm recording them, all the 9 or 10 council books, into one spreadsheet, because changes don't occur as much in the rural townlands as happen in the village. So, but yes, so I'm open to questions, and thank you for listening.
Thanks very much,
Thanks,
Kathy. Can I stop sharing the screen now?
Yes,
is that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay. And if anybody has questions, by all means, please put it into the chat box. I'm just going to look here at some of the messages. Just, does anybody have any questions? I think it's absolutely fascinating. And as one other member says here, one other committee member, it's really amazing what you can find out in those registers or in those revision books. And it is.
Can I just say, I mentioned it earlier before we went live. The council books for Northern Ireland are already up on Prony, and they've just taken digitized photographs. The Valuation Office are in the process of digitizing the council books for the 26 counties. And based on some information, I looked it up again last night. I think it's the Irish Genealogy Toolkit. It mentions that there are, I think, about 4 counties left to be photographed and digitized by the Valuation Office. And the plan is that they're going to be launched on a free of charge website towards the end of next year. But they are the photographs, in other words, the photographs I work from, how they're going to be searched, probably go to Prony. I would imagine they'll probably do something similar to Prony. So they're not transcribed in the way that I've done, but they will be available. At the moment, you need to make an appointment and go to the Valuation Office, and then either print them off at a charge or photograph them with your mobile phone. I did that in 2019 for a couple of other townlands when I was in Dublin doing some research for my dissertation. So I looked at, you know, a few places like where my mother grew up and things like that I want to transcribe at some stage. But the plan is that Valuation Office will make this information available, hopefully the end of the sooner the better as far as I'm concerned. But if they can do it by then that leaves it at least one step that you don't have to take, which is going to Dublin to do it, or pay someone to do you can engage somebody to go in and do the photography, or request. The Valuation Office has a fee, charges a fee, but you need to know the townland. So if you're doing a bit of fishing or a bit of researching and you're not 100% sure, then it can be, it's better to be able to narrow it down. So just mention that, but it's as you said, it's quite a useful, and there's lots of different ways of using it, and depending on your area of interest, how you would use the information. I've used it, as I said, with the Alice Gearan example, to locate where her family lived. I've found another couple of branches of the family that have disappeared from Clarecastle, and I've found them in other, Ballycafada and a couple of other places as well. So it's been, just for my own personal use, it's been a good exercise.
Now, we have a question for you. Were the St. Michael's Terrace occupants not recorded as the houses remained council houses? So essentially they were owned by the council and maybe the rent was subsidized.
Are you talking about St. Michael's Terrace?
Yeah, St. Michael's Terrace.
Both St. Michael's and Madden's were both built. I believe they were tenants, and most people have bought them out since. But okay. I think it's because the St. Michael's Terrace was built by a private contractor and not by the council, whereas Madden's Terrace, my understanding is, was built by the council. I might be wrong, but that's my understanding. I think because I found the same thing with, there are houses in the Quay Road which are not recorded either. The newer houses, I'm not talking about the 1880s or even the 1830s, 40s houses. There's the houses on the right-hand side going towards the quay. They were built, I believe, in the 30s. I think it was the 30s. They are not, the occupiers of those are not recorded either. But St. Joseph's Terraces, so they're St. Joseph's Terraces in Ballycafada, and they're recorded, but not. So I think it might be, Eric might have a bit more information there, but I think it was as much to do with who built them and what information was probably passed on to the valuation.
Okay. And did you find that the occupants in the rural townlands were more stable than in the villages themselves? Yes. Okay.
Well, I found a mixture. I commented on it in my dissertation. Mm-hmm. I found a mixture of, well, I'll use the example between the two censuses. About 55% of the population that was there in 1901 weren't there in 1911 in the village.
Wow.
But and obviously you allow for deaths and you allow for people marrying out and people marrying in. But what we had in Clarecastle, and probably to a certain extent still do, but more back then, was this mobility. You had teachers coming and going, you had policemen coming and going. In the case of, you had a small army, the castle, which isn't in the village, wasn't enumerated, not enumerated in the Griffith valuations. You had a small presence in the barracks in 1901, but not in 1911. So you saw some social changes happening. So, but particularly the mobility of the people that were coming with occupations. You had people that were working in Ennis, living in Clarecastle. You also saw in 1901 in the census, you still had people that the timber works. There was still some industry in the village, and that was starting to, well, I think it largely closed down by then. But after Patrick O'Brien's death, you saw a sort of a decline in particularly the sawmills, and so people that were employed by the sawmills left and went. And I tracked a lot of them to Ennis. You also found people that were still living in the parish, but there was a number of new farm labourers, cottages, and there was a few small schemes like that as well. So you had groups that were moving for different reasons, but back in 1901 you had quite a proportion of people. But equally I was able to track, there was one man in the 1901 census who was mentioned in 1855. He died in 1902, and we were able to do a line straight down. That was his story that prompted me to do, one of the reasons that prompted me to transcribe the 1896 was to see what happened to him. And in fact, all it was he had a daughter who married, and the change of surname was, he was still there, and I wanted to see what had happened. So using a bit of family history research, and we're lucky in that the Clarecastle parish records they're both transcribed in the Clare Library, but also they're available for a bit longer periods on Ancestry. So we've got transcription, and we've got the copies of the originals as searchable on Ancestry. So you're able to do some linking of families, and I've certainly employed that with unfamiliar surnames that you suddenly see a change in the surname, but in fact it's often a daughter, either if it's a female name, it's the daughter's married name, or it could be the son-in-law who takes over the tenancy. The person might be still alive, but they've got older and they've relinquished the tenancy. So that's why I often say the head of household might still be there, or the father or the mother might still be there, but the daughter or daughter-in-law. So just because you see a change in surname doesn't mean that it's gone out of the family. You need to do a little bit of work to see if there's an association, and often there is. It's often a marriage or a nephew. It's, you know, it may not be a straightforward child as well, you know. So there's a combination of both. You see a lot of people that stay, but I think it's fair to say you see less of it in the countryside. Like my own family in Cregana, John Roughan is there, and I can name them all right down to my father up to 1970. They're all there with the continuity. Yeah.
And Eric just makes the point, or do you want to make it, Eric? You're not muted, so you can speak if you want. About the tenants.
In the case of St. Michael's Terrace, I have the original tenants of those houses, and also the houses on the Key Road on the right hand side. We have listed the original tenants, but like they would have changed over the years as well. So I don't have the continuity, but we have the original people.
Yeah. Well, they're not even mentioned. They're not even all we have in the council books, certainly for St. Michael's Terrace, because I was looking at it yesterday, is the county council acquiring the land over periods from probably the 1940s. You see the changes occurring in that last council book, but just unlike Madden's Terrace, where they actually name all the people that, and in fact, there are changes in tenancy in in occupancy of houses in Madden's Terrace in the period as well, you know, just even in the 18 year period. And you can also see who moved from the old Clare Commons houses to the new ones. You know, a lot of the families that were in, you know, they're the people that, the combination, again, you can see families going right back to the 1830s when you throw in the baptism records, the council book records, and a couple of other sources. You can see continuity of a lot of families in the village. Yeah,
it's great. Anyway, I know you have to go, Kathy. You've gotten a lot of very nice complimentary remarks. It was a fantastic, very, very interesting what you can find. Very interesting. The way you've presented it as well is really, really good. And it's great to know it's online through the ICANN network. That's fantastic. And you have the maps and all, which is great. Did you want to say anything, Eric, or are you okay?
I just saw a question there from Declan about when did Clarecastle, when did it change from Clare to Clarecastle? Well, the original name of the village was Clare. It comes from the word Clare, timber bridge over the River Fergus. So the community that grew up around that crossing was called the village of Clare. And you have a lot of, like, the port of Clare. You see the name Clare used on any old maps. The village is simply called Clare. But you also then had the Castle of Clare, which is still there. So over time, the village of Clare and the Castle of Clare became amalgamated, and it became Clarecastle. But when I was growing up in the 1950s, we lived about a mile outside Clarecastle. We never said we were going into Clarecastle, simply we were going into Clare. And
I remember older people in Lausanne and stuff. They would say, "I'm going into Clare." The people that lived outside of the village.
Remember that the village of Clare gave its name to the county. That's where County Clare comes from. It's from our place, and we're proud of that. And I have the
not the Earl of Clare from Suffolk.
No, that's a myth. So Kathy and I are playing in the same team. I have the jersey there behind me.
Magpies.
So, anyway, thanks, Kathy.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I have to leave you, but thank you, Aileen.
Thank you. Thanks a million. And
if anyone has any questions, I'm happy for Eric to give them, for him to give my email address, and I'll be sending a copy of the original spreadsheet that I used to Jane, and very happy for her to share anybody who in their communities or who want to use it as a template. So I'll be doing that later today, but I do have to dash. So
okay, happy St. Patrick's Day. Yeah.
Thank you.
So thanks a million, Kathy, and we'll see you again. Just
yes.
a quick word to the others around, that our next meeting, we are going back to the Thursday nights, the third Thursday. It's the 21st of April, 8 p.m. and it's Mary Alice Wilderson who will be talking to us about famine migration to Quebec, Canada, which should be very, very interesting. Kathy has also done a master's in the history of the family, Mary Alice as has Kathy. So that should be a very, very interesting talk. Apologies again for the link. I don't know what the problem is with the link, but we will sort it out before the next meeting. And whatever it is, it's probably something very small, but apologies and many thanks to you for getting on. And the talk is recorded. It will be up in another week or two, so you will be able to see the recording if you missed any part of that, okay? So a very happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody, and we'll see you on the 21st of April on Zoom. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. Thanks a million.